Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us on our webinar on creating a progression dashboard using Vcad. I am Nicola Migliore. I am the Product Development Manager for the Vcad project at Belogic, and I will be carrying out this presentation. For those of you who don't know, Vcad is a solution that allows us to connect our BIM models with our Power BI reports. And today, we're going to have a look at how we can easily create a functional report to monitor construction progress. I'd say we jump in right into it. So for starters, we're going to go to our file manager. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Vcad, we actually have two different possibilities. We have a standalone file manager, and then we have a direct integration with Autodesk BIM 360 and Autodesk Construction Cloud. Now, everything I'm going to show you today can be done and achieved using both file managers. I usually work on BIM 360, so that's what I'm going to be doing today. So let's have a look at what the workflow looks like when you're using Vcad. So everything starts from a BIM model. In this case, I have a Revit file, which I have already processed with Vcad, which means that I am able to review the geometries. But more importantly than that, Vcad has already extracted all of the assets and properties that were defined in my model. So if we want to start out with a report, the simplest way is to start with one of the pre-made templates that Vcad gives to us. Now, when you first start out using Vcad, you will have available a set of templates, which sort of showcase some of the functionality with Vcad. Then, of course, you'll be able to create your own templates, which can include your specific business logic and data sets. For now, we're going to go with one of the defaults. Also, because we're using a Revit file today, we actually have access to all of the views and all of the faces that were created and defined in my model. But again, today we're going to keep it simple and go with a 3D view. So we're going to select the 3D view and we're going to go ahead and download the new version of the template. There, when it downloaded it, and also we're going to copy our report key, because if it's the first time we open up a report, it may ask us to use it. Next up, let's have a look at the work folder I've set up. So here I have a simple work folder with some sample data. I'm just going to copy and paste in the file that I just downloaded. This is a .pbit file, which is a regular Power BI report template file. Anyone who's used to working with Power BI is already familiar with these and knows how they work. So all we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and open up the Power BI report template with Power BI Desktop. The first time we open up the template, the data set will be set up. What's happening right now is the template is communicating with the Vcad services and it's requesting some information about that extracted metadata that we retrieved from the model previously. And we're going to have a better look at what that data looks like in a moment. So when we first open up the report, we want to have a look at the summary. The summary page gives us an overview of some of that information that was extracted from the model. And it gives us a general idea. Also, if we need more information, we have a handy dandy button here that directs us to the documentation, but we won't need it this time. Let's take a quick tour of what the standard template looks like, and then we're going to go on and create our own report. So next report page is the themes page. Here, what we're looking at is, of course, the model that we were looking at before, which is the structural information for a hospital. Every single object and geometry in the model has been automatically classified based on category, family, and symbol as they were in Revit. And to each one of these different categorizations, we have applied a color. So we can see and review the model based on a color by category, or we can go down to the family level. We can go even deeper into the actual symbol level and see how that different classification applies to the model. This was all done automatically, but we're going to be using the same mechanism later on in our final report. Let's move along. The asset detail report gives us some more in-detailed information about the actual objects that compose our model. So again, we have our model here, And here we have the list of every single object that was defined in our model. Of course, there's full interaction between the data and the model, so we can make selections in the assets list, and we can sort of highlight and zoom into the object that we're looking at inside of the model. To make things a little easier to follow along, I'm going to switch to X-ray mode. That way we don't focus too much attention on the rest of the model. We can really pay attention to what we're looking at. And also, I'll show you down here, we have the property list, which of course is being filtered out based on the object that we're looking at and showing us the relevant properties for that specific object that we are selecting. Now the X-asset tree, X-asset detail, the tab would be the next one, but it requires a bit more of an explanation and we don't want to get into that today, so we'll just skip over it for now. Finally, we have the tree report page, which shows us the actual model tree of how the Revit file is actually built and composed. And this works like we did before. So we have that interaction, that two-way interaction from the model to the data and to the data to the model. But we actually can see how the model was originally structured. Okay, so let's get going on building the report we want to build today. And specifically today, what we want to do is we want to create a report for monitoring construction progress on the job site. So we could start from scratch, but to just get things running faster, let's start from the asset detail tab. And we're just going to duplicate this page and jump into it. Let's rename it. You can call it completion. And also the title we can change to completion progress. And we don't asset. Okay. Okay, great. So already we saw some of the interaction of the data that we've extracted from the model with the actual model inside of Power BI. But when everything gets really powerful and interesting is when we start connecting external data sources. So let's do just that. We want to connect information to our model. And before we do that, I'm going to show you how the custom visual actually works and how this operation should be done. So if we select the custom visual, we can see that it's communicating with our data through this data binding called the object ID, which is coming from the assets table. Now, I don't want to get too much into it, but I'll show you quickly what the assets table looks like. And that way we can see how we can connect other data to that. So if we have a look at the assets table, it's fairly simple. We have an object ID, which is the unique identifier of every single geometry inside of the model. Then we have, of course, an object name, so the asset name. And then we have this external ID. Now, the external ID is a very important property. It is defined, it is generated when you first create the model inside of Revit, Navisworks, or the IFC, or any model you're actually looking at. And this also is a unique identifier of the object, of the asset, but it also guarantees, we're also guaranteed that this value will not change in time. So if we were to create revisions of this model, these values would always remain the same, which is why this is the data we want to use to connect to any other external data sources. Moving along, of course, we have a reference to the parent object and then a simple classification of category, family, and symbol, like we saw previously in the report. Okay, so now let's start loading into our report some external data. For that, I have some sample information that we can look at over here in my sample folder. So in my sample folder, I have two CSV files, completion data 1 and completion data 2. Let's start with completion data 1. We're going to move it back to the root, our project folder. We're going to rename it to completion data. Okay, now what we can do is we can import the data. So like we would do normally in Power BI, we can import data in any way we prefer. The data could be coming from an Excel workbook, or we could connect to an actual live database somewhere or through some APIs, or like we're going to do in this case, a simple CSV file. We're doing this because it's just the simplest and easiest to use in this demonstration. But everything I show you today will work in any case. So let's import our completion data and I'll show you what that looks like. So Power BI automatically recognized the CSV file. It found the headers, and here we have just two columns. We have an external ID and we have a completion date. So if we actually load this table in, we can then have a look at the data. Okay, and you'll notice that here we have these external IDs, which of course are the external IDs of the objects that we want to be looking at. And also we have the completion dates for the objects that have been constructed up to today. One thing we need to make sure is that in the model tree, the new data set has been correctly connected. So if we zoom out, you can see this is our new data set, completion data. If we move over to the left, here what you're seeing, I'm going to go a little fast. What you're seeing here is the automatic data tree that was built with the standard Vcad tables. So mainly the Vcad assets table and the Vcad properties table. And Power BI has correctly already identified that the external ID in my completion data matches with the Vcad assets external ID. And so it's already created the reference. So without doing anything, we're already good to go. So we can switch back to the report. Okay. Specifically in this case, today we're going to be focusing on the construction of the foundations of our building. So to really focus in on the foundations, what we can do is we can actually filter out everything else just by selecting the structural foundations. And now you see Vcad is highlighting only the objects that are of interest for our analysis today. However, the rest of the model is a bit in the way. I could switch to X-ray mode, which would already allow us to see it, but to get an even clearer picture, we can just simply tell Vcad to hide everything which is not selected. And that way we can really focus only on the foundations, which are really what we're interested in right now. Okay, so let's use that external data that we just loaded in. So let's take our assets list. And for now, we're not interested in category, family, and symbol. But instead, from the completion data, we're going to drag in the completion date. And because everything was already mapped, everything works fine. Now we can remove the hierarchy for the date, which will clean it up a little. Okay, and let's just squeeze this out a little. Okay, so now we're looking at our model, and we have the completion dates for our various objects. And if we select them, we can focus in on the specific items. And actually, if we stop zooming, we can sort of see them moving around inside of our model. Okay, this is good, and we have some interaction, but it'd be nice to be immediately able to tell what was constructed and what was not constructed. So to do that, we're going to apply some simple data transformation. So we'll simply go to the transform data. In here, we're going to have a look at our completion data. Okay, so if we have a look at our completion data, we'll notice that we either, for the completion date, we either have a date or we have a null value. Now this is handy because what we can do is we can go to the add column section and then we can add a conditional column. Here we can add a new column, which we're going to call is completed. And we're going to say that if the completion date is equals to null, then the output should be false. Otherwise, it'll be true. Press OK. OK, and we see when we have a date, we have true. When we don't have a date, we have null. And actually, right now, this column is just an alphanumeric string of characters. We want to change that type to be an actual true-false value. You can see the little icon here changed. This is just good practice, and it'll make it easier to use with some of the visuals later. Okay, great. So let's save this and close the transformation for now. Power BI is going to apply the transformations, and now actually what we can do is let's make a little room by squeezing this, and we're going to add a new slicer in. And our new slicer, we're going to put it in, drop it in right here. In our new slicer, we're going to drag in the is completed option. So now we have a toggle, which can easily allow us to toggle between everything that was completed and everything that is not completed. Okay, this is pretty good. However, we're not really using the model much for this extra information. What we'd like to do is to apply a theme, a coloring scheme to the model, which can immediately give us this information. So to do that, we can head on over back to the data transformation, and we can create a very simple classification of the completion status. To do so, we're simply going to enter some data, and we're going to have a table which has only 2 columns. It'll have a first column, which is completed, which will have 2 values. It'll either be true or it'll be false. And then we'll have another column called status color. And in here, we want to put in some a color representation in a hexadecimal code. So I have set up 2 shades that I like here. You can go with the first one. This is a shade of green. And then the second one will be a shade of red. Finally, let's call our table completion status. Okay, and enter that. Okay, perfect. So we have this very simple table with 2 values. It already recognized that it's a true false value and a connected color. So let's close and apply this as well. Okay, now let's get back to our assets list. Here, what we can do is we can add that color information from our completion status. So we're going to drag in the status color. Oh, sorry about that. Before we do this, we need to make sure that the new data set is correctly connected. So we're going to switch back to the model view. And here we can see that the new table was not connected this time. So we're going to do that by hand. It's really simple. We simply want to expand this panel a little and connect the is completed field in the completion data with the is completed field in the completion status. Okay, so now Power BI knows how these 2 tables are related to one another. Let's move back to the report. And now let's try dragging in that color again. Okay, perfect. Now I'd added the column. Of course, here we just have the color code, which isn't very helpful. Let's apply some simple conditional formatting. First, on the background, we're going to tell it that the format style will be based on the field value, and it'll take the first value of color for that specific row. I'm going to press OK, and you see the background switches to one of those 2 colors. And let's also add some more conditional formatting for the font color, and we're going to do the same thing, applying the color to the font. Okay, so now you see that we have our actual colors, and when we don't have a date, we have red, and when we do have a date, we have green. Okay, good. This already is nice, but again, we're not using the model. So let's see how we can apply these colors to our actual BIM model. So to do that, we want to select the custom visual, and then we're going to head over to the format panel. Now here we have a bunch of different options and possible customizations. Today we'll only be looking at a few of these. Mainly, we want to go to the show theme color, and we're going to toggle that on. This also has a series of defaults, which we can look at later. So now that I toggle this on, you'll see I have a select drop down here. But we only have one available color now, which is the default color, which is this green. We want to be able to set up other colors to apply on the objects that we're selecting. So to do that, we want to always, with the custom visual selected, go to the data bindings of our custom visual, and we want to look at the highlight color field. In here, we're simply going to drag in the status color. And now in our drop-down menu, we have the status color option. If we select it, there we go. You see the model immediately turns to our 2 possible colors. And this is all automatically pulling based on a categorization that we created before. Okay, just for neatness, let's rename this option so that we get a little more of an interesting name over here. Okay, So this is cool. So now we're able to tell what was constructed and what was not. Let's try and see how the construction went through time. So to do that, let's remove this search bar. We don't need it for now. And we can actually drop in another slicer, which will replace it. There we go. And in here, if we drag in the completion date, Power BI is smart enough to create a time slicer. And so now what we can do, let's focus in on what was constructed. And we can see what was constructed up to a certain date. Okay, so we can sort of navigate through time and see how our construction progressed. And we could actually focus in on a narrower set of time or actually a single date if we wanted. Well, I picked a date where there wasn't anything, but if you get a correct date, you can of course focus in on the date. However, I noticed that we now know what was constructed and we could tell what was constructed up to a certain date, but we don't know what date things were constructed in. And it would be nice to have that sort of information. So to achieve that, let's add another bit of data transformation. So if we go back to the transform data, and actually before we do that, why don't we go ahead and save the report? That way, if God forbid anything should happen, we don't lose our progress. So to do that, we can simply go to save as. We're going to save it in my folder, and we're going to call it completion progress and save. Okay, and I'm actually going to close the report, and we're going to open it back up to make sure that everything worked correctly. So here you'll notice I have a new PBIX file. This is a regular Power BI report. And anything I normally do with a Power BI report, I can keep doing with this report, including publishing it, but we'll see that later. So let's get to the report. So now we see everything is opening up again. However, the model sort of reverted to its default behavior. So we're looking at the correct data, of course, but we're seeing the whole model again. We don't have the correct theme applied. Let's fix this so that every time people enter into our report, they are presented with the view that we want them to have. So for the defaults, we simply need to select our custom visual and go again to the format section. Here, we're going to do two things. Now, first of all, I want the model to hide everything which is not selected. So to do that, we go to the PBI data to viewer section. This section commands the way the data interacts with the model. So let's start by telling the model not to zoom on what's selected. I'm not interested in that right now, so I'm going to remove the zoom on select as a default. And I am instead going to add the hide not selected as a default. Okay, so now when I open up the report next time, everything should be hidden except what we're looking at. And also, while we're at it, let's set up the default theme. So instead of -1, which is the default theme, so that green that we're looking at here, I want to add the correct index of the theme. So in this case, would be number 1. So I'm simply gonna go ahead and update this to be number 1. Okay, and we're good to go. Now to check that everything worked, I could save and close it and reopen it, but a faster way would simply be switch tab and then come back. And we can see that now the model will be loaded and then the defaults will be applied. So we're only looking at what was selected and the theme is already applied. We can actually switch to viewing both completed and not completed. Okay, so now let's get back, well, let's save this again. And let's get back to what I was talking about before, which is adding some more information about the dates in which different items were completed. So let's head on over to the data transformation. Okay, and if we have a look at all the data sets we have available in our data transformation, we have a bunch of pre-made data sets like the Vcad assets table and the Vcad properties table that we've seen before. But also we have down here, we have in the color palettes, we have 3 tables, which are very simple tables. They simply have an index and a color assigned to them. And there's just 3 different versions of the same table with different colors. And then very useful here in the functions, we have 3 different functions. So we have the Vcad funcColor2, and funcColor3. These functions, again, pretty simple. If we have a look at how they're structured, they receive as an input an index, so a number, and they output a color, which they pull from the Vcad color tables. So of course, funcColor will pull from color table, color2 will pull from color table 2, and so on. Okay, we're going to use these right now to do something interesting with the dates. So if we head on over back to the completion data. As I was saying, we'd like to have a way of sort of grouping together objects that were completed on the same date. And a good way to do that is to sort of apply a color. So let's see how to do it. We're going to start by actually grouping the table. So if we go over to group by, we can temporarily group our table based on the completion date. We're going to create a new column, which is called TMP group. And instead of applying any sort of operation, we're just going to take all the rows and smush them together. We're going to say OK. OK, now we have a single line for each date and a table connected to that date. And if we have a look at one of the tables, you can see that inside we have instead the data for all of the completions of that specific date. So let's undo this last operation. And now what we can do is if we go to the add column, we're going to add an index column. We're going to start counting from 1. So now we have numbers 1 to 22. And then on this index column, we're going to invoke a custom function, creating a new column, which we're going to call date color. And let's apply, we could apply any one of these. Let's go, which is the Vcad function color, standard one, and pull in based on, of course, our new index column. We press OK. We now have a different color for each date. Now we can remove the index column. We're not going to need that. And we can go ahead and expand this temporary table we had created. We won't need the completion date, and we do not want a prefix. Press OK, and there we go. So now we have the table we had before, but for each date, we've assigned the same color. So if we go ahead and close and apply these changes, Power BI again is going to refresh this new data set. And now, if we have a look at our assets list and we pull up our completion data, we can drag in the date color. Again, we only have code, so let's do some conditional formatting. We're going to simply, again, feed it the field value, both for the background and for the fonts. And there you go. And now we're looking at different colors based on the dates. And to get a better representation of that, let's go ahead and remove the properties. For now, we don't need them. Let's put this asset list down here, and we're going to drag in a bar chart. Okay. For the bar chart, here we want to review our data over time. So we're going to drag in the date information. Again, we want the full date, not the hierarchy. And for the values, we want to be counting the number of objects. So we're going to count the external IDs. Okay, here we go. And now we have a representation of what items, how many items were created on each date. So we know that on the 20th, on the 6th of March, 20 objects were actually constructed on the site. Of course, we've gone through all the work of defining colors. Let's actually use them. So if we go over to the format pane for the bar chart under the columns, here we can apply a function And like before, we're going to feed it the field value, and we're going to pull it from the completion data, the date color. Okay, and there we go. And now we actually have a correspondence between the items here, so these 37 items, and of course the colors that we have here. Okay, pretty cool. But again, we're not using the model. So let's see about adding these colors to our actual visual. So we're going to select the Vcad custom visual. And then in the data bindings, we're going to drag in our date color right underneath the status. Let's rename this for this visual. We're going to just call it date. And now in our drop-down menu, we have a new option for date. Great. Let's focus in on what was constructed again. So now we see everything that was constructed. And if we filter out, of course, what we expect is that we're only seeing objects of that specific color. Or if we select multiple bars of those specific colors. Okay, this is pretty cool. So now we're able to review immediately at a glance which objects, let's untoggle this, which objects were constructed and which were not. We can review that information over time, and we can actually have the information of what objects were completed in the same date. So what work packages or workloads were completed all in one day. Very cool. Now, we want to be monitoring this information. So we want this report to be updatable with new data coming in from the field. So let's see how that would work. To do that, let's go ahead and save just to make sure. And let's slightly rearrange our visuals here. So we can squeeze this down a little. We can move these further down for now. And we can remove the family and the symbol slicers. We don't need them right now. Okay, at this point, we can add two cards. So the first card, we're going to drag in the count of external IDs. So not the first external ID, we actually want a count of each and every external ID. And we're going to apply a filter to this specific visual. So right now it's showing 553. That is the total of the objects that constitute the structural foundations of my building. Let's add a filter based on the is complete column right here. And we're going to say that here we only want to count what was completed, so what is true. And let's go ahead and rename this for the visual, and we're going to call it completed. Okay, so now we know that we have 374 objects that were completed. Let's go ahead and duplicate this card, move it over here. And for this one, we want to change the filter. Instead of reviewing the ones that were completed, we want the ones that weren't completed. And of course, we're going to rename also here. So we're going to have the not completed. Okay, so now we know we have 374 that were completed and 379 which were not completed. Let's just extend this real quick. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this, this status of the report and see what happens when we update data. So right now, we're gonna simulate the update of data by simply updating this completion data file, which is, again, the file that we're feeding in to my report. We can go ahead and rename this old one. We can call it old. And then from my sample folder, I can copy my version 2 of the same file, paste it in, and rename that as well. Okay, by doing this, I basically simulated new data coming in. Now, this could work by updating, again, the Excel book that you're using, or the database that you're using, or by retrieving new data through a web API as well. For now, we're doing it simple. We're simply updating the CSV file. So now we're going to refresh the report. Power BI is going to pull in the data from that new CSV file, and also you'll notice it's pulling information from Vcad again. This means that if in the meantime I had updated the Revit file that we're using here, we would actually also have the new Revit information coming from the new version of the model. Anyway, you'll probably notice that things started moving around and changing, the colors switched. We now have 465 objects that have been completed and 88 which have not. And the actual last date is the 30th of March, which is actually in the future. Pretty cool. But in any case, we can see how that changed. And we can even see that on the last day, so on the 30th, a lot of work is being done. And now if we switch back to the status view, we can see there is definitely more green than red, which is exactly what we want to see when we're reviewing data from the field. Okay, so last thing, we can sort of copy the style all over, make it a little neater. And we've pretty much completed and done what we had set out to do, which is create a fully functional report that allows us to monitor completion progress information coming from the construction site. Now, the beauty of this is it's now running on our machine, on my machine, but I could actually go ahead and save this and publish it to Power BI Web. So I'll go ahead and do that. I have a worksheet for this called Webinar. For those of you who aren't familiar with Power BI, what's happening now is I'm actually saving locally and then I'm publishing to Power BI Web, which will allow me to use and update the same report from using a web browser. So if I follow this link, you can see I'm now in Firefox. The report is opening up and I can either go ahead and update the report like I did before. More importantly, my colleagues, which work on the same company as me, on the same tenant, they can also use and update this report. And then finally, once I'm happy with the way the report is looking and the structure it has, what I can do is I can actually go ahead and publish it to the web as a public report. And I get this link, which I can copy. And I'm actually going to drop this inside of the chat. Let's see, entire audience. I'm going to drop this in the chat. Now, everyone should be able to see the new link I pasted in the chat, and you can actually interact with it, open it up, and review the report. For anyone who doesn't have a browser available, I'll just show it real quick. If we open it up, the report opens. Of course, now it's a public report, so it's in read-only mode, so you won't be able to actually update the report, but you will be able to manipulate it and filter out the data and review the information and navigate the model also. And now you have, of course, access to the information that I have decided to share. Okay, so I went very fast, but the idea, which I hope came across, is that in a little over half an hour, we were able to start from BIM file to fully functional final report. Now, I saw some questions being pasted into or written into the question box. We'll try and get to most of the questions, or at least as many as we can, because I'm afraid we don't have a lot of time left. If you have any other questions, please go in and write them in right now. And we'll try to, well, I'll answer what I can now, and if not, we'll get back to you later, either via email or on social media like LinkedIn and things like that. Okay, so for the first question, so how do I add? Okay, so how do I add completion date? How they identify external ID to add date? Okay, so I think we went this over during the presentation. This was probably asked before. The completion date can come from any data source and any data format you want. It's up to you. The important thing is that you're in some way able to connect it to the data. In the easiest case scenario, like we did here, we would have access to the external ID. So basically this information from the assets table. But there's a number of other ways. You could also connect it through properties that were defined in your model. So often what people will do is they'll have a property under object defined in the model which is then a code that you can use to connect to other data. So that really depends on how your BIM model is set up and how your data is coming in. There's a bunch of flexibility. Okay, next question. So to perform these reports, is it necessary to work in Excel tables with encodings related to the elements of the model? No, kind of related to what I was saying before. It doesn't need to necessarily be the external ID. You can connect it to any other type of information. You could connect it to a property that you have defined in your model. So like example, a code, if you had a code defined in your model, or you could also connect it to something like the categories and families. You could group them together in any way you like. Okay, is the data bidirectional? So can we select a 3D object and view the status? Yes, this is a very good question. Unfortunately, I forgot to show you earlier. Data is, the information is absolutely bidirectional. So what you can do is you can select an item and the rest of the report will be filtered. Of course, here we're just looking at dates, so there's not a lot more, but you can use it in the case of the properties and review the properties for that specific case. And there's actually a bunch of other functionality which we're not getting into today, but you could like add tooltips which display extra information when you hover over objects or when you select them. There's a bunch of possibilities. Where can I review this video again? So after the presentation, you will be sent, I believe tomorrow, a copy of this video. And also later on down the line, we will be publishing it on our YouTube channel, which you can also check out for a bunch of other information, use cases, tutorials, and stuff like that. And also on our website, there's a bunch of documentation and articles going over how you can create these sort of reports. Okay, I think this will be the last one. Thank you for your presentation. Your dashboard is amazing tool for the digitalization of the construction center. Are you giving other conferences in the future, and where can we find your profile? Okay, thank you for the compliment. We're definitely planning on doing more presentations in the future. We're trying to get a sort of a regular flow of these presentations. And also, as I mentioned, we do release a bunch of material both on our website and on our YouTube page. Why don't I share some of that information? I'm Nicola Migliore. You can find me on LinkedIn, and also my colleague, which was instrumental in setting everything up, Francesco Necciari. He's our account manager. Definitely follow him on LinkedIn, and you can contact any one of us. If you want some specific information about how you can set up a trial, for example, or how you can get started with Vcad, write us an email at support@bimservices.it. And finally, our website, bimservices.it. There you can find a whole bunch of information, material, and also the references to our YouTube account, or in any case, just search for Vcad or BIM services on YouTube and you'll find our videos. There's a bunch of material there that you can sort of jump into. Okay, so I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank every one of you for joining us. Absolutely, thank you for coming. It's only fun if there's someone else on the other side, so definitely thank you. Keep in touch, and we'll absolutely answer all of the missing questions. As I said, either by shooting you an email, or if you're already our contacts on LinkedIn, we'll get back to you on LinkedIn. Thanks, everyone. You have a nice rest of your day.